It's currently 7 a.m. Thursday the 9th of January 2025. In this recording, I'd like to talk about the avenue of being able to subtly remote influence people through means of electromagnetic frequencies. This is typically associated with extreme low frequency, alongside terms like psychotronics. Now, I first became exposed to the avenue of weaponizing electromagnetism upon reading the book Mind War by Michael Aquino. Michael Aquino was the head of psychological operations for the US military. The book touches upon the topic of branches in the military for abnormal warfare, often seeking ways to peacefully resolve conflicts with electronic warfare, mind control, and psychological operations. Though there was one part of the book that stood out to me, and this was Robert O. Becker and his experiments of research, where he was looking at biological changes due to the exposure to electromagnetic fields. A few things mentioned: the television screen showing changes in a biological system under exposure to weak electromagnetic fields. From up to 60 feet away, the extreme low frequency that's emitted can accelerate or decrease human reaction time, so making them sleepy or more awake. Another being the overhead high voltage power lines. Those subject to strong magnetic fields emitted from such things statistically show to have much higher suicide expectations. There was also many other things mentioned describing many physiological changes in people and animals too. Here mentioned that electromagnetic radiation has led to a variety of blood changes that may be responsible for new diseases since the 1950s developing from pathogens. Previously incapable of inducing diseases, Lyme's, AIDS, and herpes were all referenced. Now, this is something that stands out to me pretty heavily if you end up researching things like invasive wetware, and I plan to make a video to follow up on this. Later on, my reading of Mind War brought me to someone called John C. Lilly. He was educated in the ways of psychoanalysis, neuroscience, and mind control, often using drugs or electromagnetic means. He worked with both the Navy and the CIA's MKUltra, looking for ways to make people more susceptible to programming. Now, what's talked about amongst targeted individuals is John C. Lilly's Lilly wave, which is essentially a signal that's injected into the power grid with a specific waveform and frequency, which is supposed to bring people down into low alpha and sort of stop them from thinking critically and make them susceptible for psychological operations, whether that's to stop questioning what's being thrown on the news, or for more covert means of manipulating someone with mind control. Now, the avenue of employing that type of weaponry is pretty heavily discussed in Mind War, in where Michael Aquino proposes how certain divisions would go about utilizing some forms of this technology to influence people of the public, and eventually utilizing it to be paired with nationwide propaganda, news reports, or maybe even an election to sway the minds into agreeing with some idea or narrative pushed out there. Now, you'll actually find that the TV itself is a very potent tool at kind of making people almost disassociate with the world briefly, where they're brought into low alpha, and where you end up thinking more on the right hemisphere of the brain and ultimately less critically. Now, the Lilly wave isn't the only thing that could be weaponized, as I stated, just from TV screens alone. Just from 60 feet away, from studies back to, I think, the 50s, you can have your cognizance affected. You could be much more alert, or have completely decreased reaction time, much more groggy, sleepy. This is electrosmog, but if weaponized, you can start to stress the body and the mind to have anxiety, a sense of threat. You could invoke forms of emotions, and this is what's being done today, though it's pretty esoteric. I've seen it mentioned a few times where these forms of tools have been utilized in megachurches, which can give a completely different take on a service, where all of a sudden the whole crowd is subject to a much more enhanced experience. It's also been recorded to be used inside restaurants, high-end restaurants that want to turn the tables quicker, stress people just enough to give them anxiety through pulsing something just through the power grid, where they'll eat their food a little quicker and turn tables. Now, you can affect emotional states, but you can also entrain the brainwave, supposedly, too. So now you've got a platform for remote mind control, which will be weaponized by practices that we've seen openly discussed by people like John Norseen or Robert Duncan. In my previous recording, I mentioned that I could go around any room that I've spent enough time in, and I'll start picking up dirty electricity pulsed through the power grid if I take my handheld radio. Though, if I had an oscilloscope, I could most likely show you the exact frequency that's being pulsed through it and the type of waveform too. So not just for auditory effect, but actually stressing the body and mind and influencing specific states. You can find many studies out there that show classrooms with children that have behavioral disorders, all of a sudden, when moved to a classroom that is more off-site the school or in a room with less electrosmog, a lot of their symptoms seem to disappear, no longer needing any form of medication at all, and perfectly able to concentrate and function in school correctly. But yet we find a stigma put through media and subtle programming that teaches people that electromagnetism is perfectly safe and it doesn't affect us in the slightest. And this isn't true at all.